What if a simple piece of bread could forever change a man's destiny? In the arid heart of the Old West, where hunger devoured families and violence seemed to be the only law, a story of redemption began with an unexpected gesture. Imagine an exhausted cowboy named Ezekiel Carter, known by many as an outlaw beyond return, lost in his choices and marked by a life of mistakes. Now, picture a small native boy, Kaya, who, even while facing drought, poverty, and an empty stomach, reaches out to offer the last piece of bread he had. Seems unlikely, doesn't it? But it's precisely here that life reserves its greatest surprises. In the Old West, life was harsh, merciless, and often unfair. Entire villages suffered from lack of supplies, families survived day after day hoping to find food, and every stranger who appeared on the horizon carried both a threat and a promise. Ezekiel Carter was the portrait of danger, a man with scars on his soul and a history stained by crime. Many would consider him a lost cause, someone with no chance of redemption. But what happens when a wounded heart is confronted with a gesture of kindness so pure it defies all logic? Have you ever gone through that? Have you ever come across an act so simple yet so powerful that it changed the way you saw the world? In the Old West, a piece of bread was not just food. It was life. It was hope. It was resistance. And for Kaya, the native boy, sharing what he had wasn't only about quenching a stranger's hunger, but about keeping alive the essence of what his mother, Anahi, had always taught him: compassion. Now imagine the scene. The scorching sun beat down on the cracked earth, the wind carried dust and weariness, and in the middle of this arid landscape, a small boy holds what's left of his meal. In front of him, a hard-eyed man, dirtied by the road, with a gun hanging from his waist and life weighing on his shoulders. Who in their right mind would give their last piece of bread to someone like that? But that's exactly what Kaya did. And that act, as simple as it was unlikely, began to write a new chapter in the life of Ezekiel Carter. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. This isn't just a story of survival. It's a narrative of transformation, where the harshness of the Old West meets the purity of an innocent heart. And in the meeting of these two worlds, the outlaws and the native boys, is born a lesson capable of crossing generations. As night fell over that small forgotten village, the stars illuminated the silent reflection of a man who had lost almost everything, but who, suddenly, received more than just food. He received a second chance. The cowboy, hardened by life, now faced a choice that would change everything. Could a child's kindness truly break the chains of a criminal past? This is the story we are about to unravel together. A tale of courage, compassion, and redemption amid the brutality of the Old West. And the most impressive part is that it all begins with the gesture of a boy and the piece of bread he decided to share. What happened the next day is something few could have predicted. While Ezekiel Carter rested that silent night, with the simple taste of bread still lingering in his mouth, something inside him began to change. It was as if each piece of that food carried not only sustenance, but also an invisible message, that there was still room for kindness, even in a heart hardened by the Old West. Kaya's gesture was not grand in the eyes of the world, but for a man lost in his own darkness, it meant the chance to breathe again. And perhaps that's exactly what touches us most in stories like this, because deep down, we've all lived moments when a small act of affection, an unexpected gesture, was able to ignite a spark of hope. And this is the point where I want to invite you to participate as well. If this subject makes sense to you, leave in the comments what touched you the most so far. It can be a memory, an opinion, or even a feeling that arose while listening to this story. Your voice matters, and sharing what you feel can inspire other people who are going through similar moments. And since we're building together this space of emotional stories, take a moment to like this video. It may seem simple, but every like helps this message go further, touch more lives, and show that it's still worth talking about compassion, hope, and transformation. And if you want to keep following stories like this, full of emotion and meaning, subscribe to the channel. Your participation here is what makes this space grow and reach more and more people who also seek this kind of content. Because, in the end, it's not just about hearing a story. It's about forming a community that believes in the power of small gestures to change destinies. And as Ezekiel Carter faced that new morning, carrying within him the impact of Kaya's gesture, The feeling was that the future could be different, even in the relentless territory of the Old West. The village seemed forgotten by time, as if it had been left to its own fate in the middle of nowhere. The sun beat mercilessly, cracking the hard earth that no longer bore fruit, and the wind brought more dust than hope. There, survival was not a choice. It was a daily battle against hunger, thirst, and loneliness. The wooden houses creaked in the wind, small, fragile constructions that seemed to resist more out of stubbornness than real strength. Among these houses, entire families clung to the little they had, sharing every crumb, every drop of water, as if they were treasures. Natives and settlers lived side by side, but both faced the same cruel reality. Men left early, trying to hunt or bargain for some supplies, while women cared for the children and kept the home standing, even when everything seemed to be falling apart. The drought showed no mercy, the land offered nothing, and every face bore the mark of exhaustion. It was in this scenario of scarcity that small gestures of solidarity made all the difference, for any help, no matter how small, had a huge impact on everyone's life. For the youngest, like Kaya, the weight of reality came far too soon. Childhood was stolen by circumstances, and instead of playing freely, he learned to deal with responsibilities far too heavy for his age. Even so, his mindset was shaped by something greater. The words of his mother, Anahi, who always reminded him that compassion was the only path capable of transforming a hardened heart. It was this hidden truth that kept the boy steady, even when his empty stomach asked for more than he could receive. Ezekiel Carter, upon arriving there, found a community surviving on the edge of the abyss. For him, who came from a life surrounded by violence and wrong choices, witnessing that silent struggle awakened something long buried within him. He saw in the people of the village the reflection of something he had lost, the ability to believe. And in a way, it was as if the backstage of his own life was being revealed before his eyes. The outlaw who once believed only in the power of weapons was beginning to realize there was another kind of strength, the strength of unity. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what was happening in that village was not just a matter of physical survival, but also a spiritual and emotional battle. The journey of those people was marked by daily choices that required courage and faith. They had to decide whether they would continue living just to resist, or whether they would find, even in scarcity, a reason to believe in a different tomorrow. And in this contrast between despair and hope, Ezekiel found himself facing a revelation. Perhaps his own redemption was hidden in the simplicity of those people. The details of this setting carried powerful symbolism. The dry land, apparently dead, resembled the heart of a man weary of their mistakes. But just as the desert can bloom after the rain, an unexpected gesture could bring forth new life inside someone. The impact of this environment on Ezekiel was not only external, but internal. He was being confronted not by weapons, but by glances, by gestures, by silent truths that imposed themselves without shouting. This coexistence, even if brief, made it clear that every decision made in that place carried weight. Kaya's decision to share his bread, Anahi's decision to teach, compassion, the decision of every man to leave home to fight for his family. And in the midst of it all, the decision Ezekiel would soon have to make: remain chained to his dark past, or allow this experience to completely transform his mindset. It is at this point that the story begins to gain an even deeper dimension, because we are not only talking about a village lost on the map, but about a reflection of who we are in the face of adversity. The setting is just the stage, but the true spectacle happens within hearts. Ezekiel Zeke Carter walked as if carrying the weight of an entire world on his shoulders. Sweat ran down his sunburned face, dust clung to his worn clothes, and every step seemed forced, as if his body no longer obeyed him. He had escaped ambushes, ridden through endless nights, but now he was there at the edge of his own limits. His hardened gaze revealed a life marked by wrong choices, by decisions that had led him to be seen only as another outlaw with no return. Yet behind that cold expression, there was a man in shambles, tormented by memories that insisted on resurfacing when silence grew too heavy. The sound of hooves that once accompanied him no longer existed. His horse had collapsed days earlier, a victim of exhaustion. Since then he had walked on foot, guided only by the instinct to survive, and by the faint hope of finding some place to rest. But even hope seemed to mock him. Hunger burned his stomach, thirst scorched his throat, and his muscles trembled as if screaming for surrender. Zeke, who had so often faced death without fear, now felt small before it. Deep down, he knew his journey wasn't just physical. Each step in the desert seemed to bring buried memories back to life. The faces of innocents who had crossed his path, the looks of fear, the promises left unfulfilled. It was as if the Old West, with its vast silence, revealed the backstage of his own conscience. There, with nowhere to run, the hidden truth surfaced. Mercilessly, he had lost more than gold or freedom. He had lost himself. And when his feet finally touched the dirt road that led to that forgotten village, it wasn't just exhaustion that made him stop. It was the feeling that something greater awaited him there, even if he couldn't explain why. The place seemed simple, poor, battered by drought, but for Zeke, it carried the weight of an inevitable destiny. Every shuttered window, every wary glance cast from a distance, reminded him that his reputation preceded him. It was impossible to hide who he was, and yet all he sought was a plate of food and a little rest. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because Zeke's arrival in that village was not just the end of a flight. It was also the beginning of a silent transformation. Many times life leads us to unexpected places when we are at our limit, as if it were there, at the lowest point of our journey, that we finally gain clarity about the impact of our choices. For Zeke, hunger and loneliness were only visible symptoms, but the real weight lay within him, the mindset of a man who no longer knew if he was capable of change. And isn't it curious how, sometimes, it's in the moment when we are at our weakest that the greatest revelations arise? When there's no more strength left to uphold the mask, what surfaces is the raw truth, the one we tried to ignore for so long. For Zeke, it was the realization that the life of an outlaw had given him nothing but scars. The gold he once held was gone, the partners who once rode with him had disappeared, and all that remained was loneliness. It was the inevitable consequence of a string of bad decisions, now revealed before him like a mirror of the past. The impact of this realization was as strong as the hunger consuming him. He didn't want to admit it, but he knew he was standing at an invisible crossroads. Continue carrying the same burden as always, or allow that new reality to truly confront him. And this decision wouldn't be made with weapons or coins, but with the courage to face himself. As he took his first steps into the village, Zeke felt eyes following him. They weren't looks of admiration, but of caution and fear. He knew what it meant. His presence was a living reminder that the past always exacts its price. Still, something inside him whispered that perhaps it was precisely in that place, among those simple people, that a new page could be written. Kaya was just a boy, but within him lived a wisdom that seemed far greater than his few years. His dark hair fell over curious, attentive eyes, always ready to observe every detail of the village's hard life. His bare feet knew every stone on the ground, every beaten dirt path, but what truly set him apart was not physical strength or the agility of youth. It was his pure heart, shaped by the values his mother, Anahi, repeated like a mantra. To share, even when nothing is left, is what keeps the soul alive. In that village, forgotten by time, poverty was a constant visitor, and still Anahi believed that compassion was the only wealth that could not be stolen. That was exactly what she passed on to her son in every daily gesture. When she saved a small portion of a meal for someone who had even less, when she cared for sick neighbors even while exhausted, or when, in the midst of scarcity, she looked at Kaya and said, "Generosity is what keeps us human." Those words echoed inside him like a hidden truth, something that didn't need to be explained, only lived. And almost naturally, Kaya learned to see the world through that lens of compassion, understanding that the impact of a small decision could transform another person's journey. That afternoon, when Ezekiel Carter arrived at the village, staggering from hunger and exhaustion, Kaya held in his hands the last piece of bread left from his meal. It was little, almost nothing, but for a hungry boy it meant a lot. Even so, upon seeing the man's weary face and gaze hardened by life, his heart did not waver. There was no calculation, no fear, only the reflection of what he had always learned from his mother. He knew that peace could silence his hunger for a few moments, but he also knew it could have a much greater impact in the hands of someone who seemed on the verge of collapse. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because Kaya's gesture was not just an act of childish charity, it was a conscious decision shaped by a mindset that few adults possessed. Deep down, he was showing that true strength was not in possessing, but in giving. This is a powerful revelation because it makes us realize that many times it is the simplest who carry the greatest life lessons. Kaya had nothing in excess, there was no abundance, but what he did have was enough to show the value of solidarity. And it is curious how, amid the harshness of the Old West, it was precisely the purity of a child that disarmed, even if invisibly, the heart of an outlaw. Ezekiel's transformation began right there with that silent gesture, because when someone used to receiving distrust and hatred is faced with an unexpected act of kindness, the mind enters into conflict. It's as if the backstage of the soul itself were revealed, showing that there is still a chance to choose another path. For Zeke, that bread was much more than food. It was a symbol, a reminder that there was still room to change, no matter how late it seemed. And perhaps this is the most impressive point. Kaya's impact did not come from great speeches, nor from physical strength or social position. It came from a small choice, but one loaded with meaning. He reminds us that the simplest decisions can have immense consequences, that the mindset of giving can be the starting point for a journey of transformation. And this is a revelation we cannot ignore, because it shows how even the youngest can teach truths that many adults forget to live by. The dirt road was silent. When Ezekiel Zeke Carter, already without strength, staggered to the entrance of the village, his steps were slow, heavy, and every movement revealed the exhaustion that consumed him. Sweat ran down his face, his cracked lips barely able to close, and his lost gaze carried both hunger and loneliness. He looked like a shadow of himself, a survivor on the brink of collapse, and perhaps that's exactly what he was. A man pursued by the past, with no place in the present, and no certainty of the future. It was in this state that he crossed paths with Kaya. The boy, barefoot and sharp-eyed, held in his hands what remained of his small meal, a piece of bread already hardened with time, but still enough to quiet hunger for a few hours. His eyes met Zeke's, and in that instant there was a silence greater than the sound of the wind carrying dust. The man, with a gun hanging at his belt and the shadow of an outlaw stamped in his stance, stared at the boy as if unable to understand why someone wouldn't run. And the boy, fragile in size but firm in heart, extended the bread without hesitation. There was suspense in that gesture. It wasn't just the giving of food, it was the revelation of unexpected courage. Why help an armed, dangerous man, known for stories whispered through villages? Perhaps because for Kaya, kindness did not depend on who received it, but on the truth carried within oneself. And this was the teaching that Anahi, his mother, had planted in his heart. When you share the little you have, you become part of the transformation the world so desperately needs. Zeke held the bread with trembling hands, and in that instant, something different happened within him. It was as if the weight of the past was, for a moment, challenged by the impact of a gesture that made no sense in his logic of survival. He, who was used to seeing distrust in every look, now received trust from someone who owed him nothing. That small decision of Kaya's had the power of a revelation, showing the outlaw a hidden truth. There was still room for compassion even in the most barren territory of existence. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because what seemed like just a chance encounter was, in fact, the beginning of a journey of transformation. Many times what changes the course of our story are not great events, but the silent choices that catch us by surprise. A boy with a piece of bread may not seem like much, but for a man worn down by life, that was more than food. It was the reminder that there was another possible path, that perhaps there was still salvation, even for someone so marked by mistakes. This unexpected encounter also reveals how a mindset can be broken in an instant. Zeke had gotten used to believing that the world was made only of violence and betrayal, but in seconds his vision was challenged by something entirely different, and this rupture is powerful because it shows that no one is completely lost. Behind the scars, there is always the possibility of a new beginning, and sometimes all it takes is for someone to extend a hand or a piece of bread. The impact of that gesture could not be measured only by the stomach being fed, but by the emotional shock it provoked. Zeke stood before an invisible choice, to accept that gesture as a simple coincidence or to see it as the beginning of a revelation. And deep down, this was the kind of decision that could change the entire course of his journey. Night came slowly, as if the sky itself wanted to give Zeke a few more moments to reflect. The village sank into silence, interrupted only by the distant sound of crickets and the cold wind blowing between the wooden houses. Zeke settled into an improvised corner, still with the piece of bread in his hands. The simple smell of that food seemed to carry a disproportionate strength, and each bite brought with it a mixture of relief and discomfort. His body thanked the sustenance, but his mind would not let him rest. As he chewed, memories he had buried resurfaced with unexpected clarity. Images of his childhood appeared like echoes, his mother's voice, firm and loving, saying that kindness was the only true wealth. His father's laughter before the harshness of life changed him. The days when he too believed the world could be fairer. They were distant, almost forgotten memories, but Kaya's gesture had opened a breach in the wall he had built around his own heart. The silence of that night became a mirror, and in it Zeke saw the hidden truth he had avoided for so long. The man he had become was the result of a sequence of decisions that always seemed inevitable, but deep down had been choices. And now, standing there with the taste of bread still in his mouth, he asked himself at what point he had lost the ability to believe. Why could a boy who barely had enough to eat extend his hand without hesitation, while he, an adult hardened by life, only knew how to take? That thought unsettled him, because it shook not only his conscience but his identity. Zeke had always seen himself as a survivor, someone who did whatever it took to stay standing. But what if deep down, survival wasn't just about fighting against the world? What if survival also meant allowing kindness in, even when it seemed there was no room for it? This revelation wasn't easy to accept, but the impact of Kaya's gesture was clear. It reignited something he believed was dead: hope. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because hope is a dangerous territory for someone who has grown used to living in the shadows. It demands a change of mindset, a repositioning before one's own journey. For Zeke, it wasn't just about feeling grateful for a piece of bread, but about realizing that there were still paths to follow different from the ones he had chosen so far. It was as if the universe had staged a specific scene to confront him. A boy with nothing, but with the courage to give. An outlaw with everything to lose, but with a chance to receive. The transformation began in a silent, almost invisible way, but it was real. That bread did not only feed the stomach, it fed the memory that no matter how far someone had gone, there was always the possibility of returning. And this was a hard revelation, because it required Zeke to face what he had done up to that point. The mistakes, the scars, the ghosts. But it also brought an uncomfortable question. Would he have the courage to choose differently from then on? While the village slept, Zeke remained awake, looking at the starry sky that stretched over the desert. Each point of light seemed a reminder that, despite the darkness, there is always something shining, even if far away. He had no answers, but for the first time in a long while he had a sincere question. What if there was still redemption for him? The sun rose slowly over the village, painting the simple wooden houses in gold and revealing the fine dust lifted by the morning wind. For most of the villagers, it was just another day of struggle against the drought, another chapter of survival. But for Ezekiel Carter, that dawn carried a completely different meaning. After an entire night immersed in memories and reflections, he awoke with something he hadn't felt in years, a clear decision within himself. The weight of hunger was still there, exhaustion still burned in his bones, but for the first time, that was not what defined him. He knew he no longer wanted to be just the outlaw everyone feared, nor the shadow of a man lost in his own mistakes. Kaya's simple gesture had opened a crack in his mind, and through that gap, the idea of a new beginning began to take root. Zeke looked at his own calloused hands, marked by battles, robberies, and escapes, and wondered if it was still possible to use them for something other than destruction. The silence of the morning seemed to answer, not with words, but with a sensation he hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. It was as if that piece of bread had planted an invisible seed now beginning to sprout inside him. The decision was not accompanied by grand gestures or loud promises. It was something internal, almost secret, like a hidden truth finally finding space to emerge. He knew the path would not be easy, because transformation does not happen overnight. It required different choices, a renewed mindset, and above all, the courage to face not only external enemies, but the inner ghosts that had always haunted him. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because Zeke's awakening is a portrait of something that happens to many of us. Sometimes it only takes one specific moment, one seemingly small decision, to change the entire direction of our journey. The difference lies in how we respond to those moments. Some ignore them, others resist them, but those who choose to embrace them find revelations capable of rewriting their stories. Zeke, accustomed to living by the instincts of survival, now found himself before a new kind of decision, to live not only for himself, but for something greater. And the impact of this is profound. It is not just about abandoning a life of crime, but about rebuilding an identity. He was tired of being remembered as a fugitive, as an outlaw with no future. What he sought, even if he couldn't explain it, was redemption. A chance to prove that, despite the scars and mistakes, it was still possible to move forward in another way. This journey of change was not just an escape from the past, but a conscious choice for a different future. As the village began its daily routine, Zeke took a deep breath, smelling the dry earth mixed with the cold morning air. The scenery around him looked the same, but inside everything had changed. What had once been only despair was now possibility. He didn't know exactly how, but he was determined to find a new path. And this silent commitment to his own transformation was the first step toward something much greater. The sun was already high when Ezekiel Carter reappeared in the village, but this time he did not come empty-handed, nor with the heavy shadow of one who only brought trouble. He carried on his back and in his arms some supplies he had managed to gather. Sacks of flour, dried meat, and some basic provisions that for those people meant far more than simple food. The villagers, accustomed to distrusting his every move, watched in silence. It was strange to see the man, feared as an outlaw, now walking with the posture of one who wanted to offer help. For Kaya and Anahi, however, that gesture spoke louder than any words. The boy ran to him with shining eyes, not fully understanding how a piece of bread could have triggered such a change. Anahi, though cautious, recognized in Zeke's actions something rare, the sincerity of someone who had decided to follow another path. It was not charity to redeem himself in the eyes of others, but an inner movement, a conscious choice to return what he had received in the form of compassion. For someone like Zeke, sharing supplies was more than offering food. It was proof to himself that he was not condemned to repeat the mistakes of the past. This attitude did not go unnoticed by the other villagers. The community lived in constant alert, surrounded by threats from both outside and within. Bands of raiders roamed the region, and there was always the memory of old broken alliances. Among those memories was Silas Granger, Zeke's former partner in crime, a cold man with no moral restraint, who would never accept seeing anyone abandon the outlaw's life. The simple rumor that Zeke was trying to change was enough to awaken Silas's fury, and Zeke knew it. That is why, when he delivered the supplies, he also made a silent commitment clear. He would be there to protect Kaya, Anahi, and everyone else against anyone who dared to threaten them. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because this decision to protect and give back what he had received was not just a one-time gesture, but a turning point of transformation. When someone chooses to change, it is not enough to just think differently. One must act differently, even if that involves risks. And Zeke, by standing against his own past, showed that he had understood this hidden truth. Redemption requires courage. He was not only stepping away from the shadow of crime, he was facing head-on the backstage of his own story, confronting those who symbolized his worst choices. And there is something powerful in this kind of decision, because it is not only about defending oneself, but about taking responsibility for those who believed in you, even silently. Kaya and Anahi had given him their trust, and now it was his turn to show that such trust had not been in vain. The impact of this cycle of generosity was evident. The boy's gesture had sparked a change in Zeke's heart, and that change was now turning into protection and care for the entire community. It was a movement that grew almost like ripples in a lake, spreading from a single point, but reaching farther and farther. Deep down, Zeke understood that Silas represented more than a physical enemy. He was the living reminder of who Zeke had once been, the reflection of everything he wanted to leave behind. Facing him would not be only a matter of survival, but of proving to himself that he was capable of holding firm to his decision to change. The journey of redemption is not built only in thoughts or beautiful words, but in concrete actions in the face of difficulties. And this revelation brought with it both fear and determination. Kaya watched everything with the purity of someone who sees beyond appearances. To him, it didn't matter how many heavy stories Zeke carried. What mattered was what stood before his eyes. A man trying to be different, trying to begin again. And perhaps that was the true reward, not only the supplies, but the sense that Zeke's heart was beginning to find a new purpose. Jonathan Miles knew well the weight a name carried in the Old West. As sheriff of the small village, he had heard stories of Ezekiel Carter long before seeing him there in the flesh. To many, Zeke was just another outlaw, a man condemned by his own decisions, too dangerous to approach, too unpredictable to trust. That was how Miles saw him at first, a threat that needed to be watched closely, someone who could bring even more trouble to a community, already weakened by hunger and fear. But upon seeing with his own eyes Zeke's recent actions, something began to change. The sheriff observed from a distance as the former criminal walked among the houses carrying supplies, sharing what he had managed to bring, greeting villagers who once avoided his gaze. It was no performance, no theatrics. There was, in fact, a different posture, a calmer look, almost regretful, but firm in a decision that seemed greater than himself. For Jonathan, accustomed to measuring men by the coherence between their words and actions, this was significant. An outlaw rarely abandoned his life, but here was a clear revelation. Zeke didn't just want to survive, he wanted to transform. At first, the community hesitated. People remembered the rumors, the tales of robberies and betrayals, and they kept their distance. But little by little, the reality of his actions spoke louder than the memory of legends. It was impossible to ignore that this same man was now helping, protecting, and showing himself willing to face external threats like that of Silas Granger. Jonathan, who had so often had to raise his hand against criminals, now found himself in a rare situation, the chance to witness someone abandon darkness and seek redemption. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because the way we perceive someone's transformation says a lot about our own mindset. Many times, we are quick to point fingers, but reluctant to believe that a person can truly change. Jonathan carried that distrust, but the hidden truth that emerged before him was that, despite all the filth of the past, Zeke was now acting differently. The impact of this was powerful, because it showed not only the strength of a man in transformation, but also the courage of a community to reevaluate its perceptions. And it is at this point that we see the depth of this journey. Redemption does not happen only within the one who seeks to begin again, but also in the eyes of those who watch and must decide whether or not to believe in that change. For the sheriff, accustomed to living in the backstage of the law, dealing with lies, betrayals, and empty promises, Zeke's sincerity was a shock. For the first time in years, he found himself before an outlaw who wore no masks, who was truly willing to face the consequences of his choices and write a new story. This process of acceptance was not immediate. Jonathan knew that trust is something built, not demanded. But with each of Zeke's gestures, something solidified within him. The sense that perhaps this man could be more than a threat. Perhaps he could be an ally, someone capable of protecting the village not by the strength of the law, but by the strength of a personal decision. And this revelation, slow and steady, was transforming not only the sheriff's perception, but also the way the villagers began to react. The weight of an entire life does not disappear overnight, but the impact of each right choice gradually erases the marks of the past. Jonathan understood this, and for that very reason he did not take his eyes off Zeke. He was not only watching a man change, he was witnessing a rare journey of transformation, the kind that becomes a silent example for everyone around. Sometimes the greatest changes are born from gestures so small they seem almost invisible. That piece of bread, extended by Kaya in a moment of simplicity and courage, was not just food for a weary man. It was the spark that rekindled in Ezekiel Carter the memory that there was still room for choice, that life could be more than a trail of mistakes and pursuits. And this shows us something profound. In the Old West, where law was often dictated by the gun, it was compassion that proved to have the greatest impact. This revelation carries a strength that goes beyond the story itself. Because if we stop to think, how many times have we gone through situations where a simple gesture completely changed our mindset? It could be a supportive look, an encouraging word, or even a respectful silence at the right moment. These are acts that, seen from the outside, may seem small, but within someone's journey, they can be decisive. And that's what happened with Zeke. He discovered that he no longer had to carry the weight of his wrong decisions alone. He just had to allow kindness to break the cycle of pain and violence in which he was trapped. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because true transformation never happens in a grand way, but in the detail, in the background, in the instant when someone decides not to respond with hardness, but with humanity. The hidden truth of this story is that it was not the force of weapons, nor the power of the law that started the change. It was the giving of a boy who barely had enough for himself, yet still believed in the value of sharing. This is powerful because it exposes what truly moves the world. Not brutality, but the acts of compassion that multiply and inspire new paths. Ezekiel Carter could have ignored that gesture, could have swallowed the bread and moved on, stuck in the same cycle as always. But he decided to look deeper, to allow that experience to reveal something greater. This decision was the turning point, because it showed that change only happens when we let the actions of others affect us, when we make room for kindness to confront us. The impact of that moment was not limited to Zeke. It reached the entire village, which learned to see in that man more than just an outlaw. And that is the great lesson that echoes from this narrative. Sometimes, a simple act of kindness can change not only a life, but an entire destiny. In the Old West, where the law was the gun, compassion proved to be more powerful. And if this was possible in such an arid and relentless setting, imagine what could happen in our own lives when we choose generosity over indifference, empathy over judgment. And if you made it this far, it's because this story made sense to you in some way. And that makes me happy, because it means the message that began with a simple piece of bread has also found space in your heart. So tell me, if you were in Kaya's place, would you have the courage to share your last meal with a stranger? Write it in the comments, and I'd love to know how you see that gesture. And since we've walked together through this journey of transformation and hope, leave your like on this video. It's a simple way to show that this connection made a difference, and at the same time, it helps me keep bringing stories that touch and inspire. Subscribe to the channel too. That way we keep going together, building this space where each narrative brings a new reflection, a new impact, a new chance to see life from another angle. And it doesn't end here. There's another story right next to this one that I'm sure will move you even more. Click and continue with me there, because each story is an opportunity to learn to feel and to transform yourself a little more.